Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. China embarks on a once-in-a-decade leadership transition later this week. And today we will be talking about that and China's global role with one of the US's top military strategists and historians on China. He's Edward Luttwak, who is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he joins us today in that studio. And he's the author of many books and articles, including The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy. Mr. Luttwak, thank you very much for being on the show. Let's start with the transition of power in China. Do you expect anything more than a shift in style as the baton passes to slightly younger leaders?
I'm not an expert in this, and I follow carefully expert opinion that predicts a continuity of substance and a very slight change in style. If these people come to the top, they reach Xi Jinping, for example, would have brought a totally different style if he'd come to power 20 years ago. But by the time they're processed and cooked and reach the standing committee, a certain uniformity is hammered into them.
Do you think there's any chance of more pressure, perhaps domestic pressure, for political change now that this corruption probe has been launched, the largest in 50 years? Do you think there are any domestic factors there that could bring about more profound change?
Well, I think there is a steadily rising pressure on the system because of the steady loss of authority of the Communist Party. The Communist Party's ideology is, of course, even more and more inappropriate to a capitalist China. It is simply fairly absurd to see the picture of a National People's Congress representing everybody where top businessmen really run the show. And so the ideology is disappearing. There are probably fewer convinced communists in China today than there are in France, in spite of the decline of the French party. And at the same time, their prestige keeps being eroded by corruption and very much accelerating this phenomenon in the last year or so. In the last year or so, the Chinese internet is just full of information about very detailed, specific information, not vague rumors, but rather Xi Jinping's sister owns so many shares of this company worth $300 million, plus this house, here's the picture, in Hong Kong, and this is what the tax value of it, and so on. So each leader has now been identified as the center of a web of corruption, and this, of course, creates tensions within the party because there are those with BMWs and those who have old motorcycles still, and it destroys the authority of the party.
Is that irreversible, or could the new leaders clean things up?
Well, cleaning up, so Xi Jinping would have to get rid of his sister, and each one of these leaders would have to, sort of deal with his wife, brother, son, and daughters who are now, all the sons and daughters, or grandsons and granddaughters, are all studying in the United States in very expensive colleges, and drive around with Porsches and so on, and Ferraris. And so, yes, they could do it, but they would have to start with their own families in a fairly drastic way. I don't think this is likely. What is more likely is the sinking of the party.
I want to come on to your book, The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy. You argue that when a country becomes economically powerful, it should restrain itself militarily. So if it has the money to build 10 battleships, it shouldn't build even one. It's very counterintuitive and also, I would argue, unrealistic, because China has global interests, shipping routes, trade routes, access to natural resources in Africa, its own citizens abroad, a host of things that it has to protect militarily.
Well, the way it works is that if your economy is expanding as it was at 9% per year, even now possibly 7%, keeps expanding, you're becoming more and more important economically, then your importance and your influence can also expand at the same time. But if you also do the third thing, which is build your military power, as they have been doing, by spending more, in fact, military expenditure growing faster than the economy, then you alarm your neighbors. So, and you cannot do all three things. You cannot get much richer, more influential, and keep alarming your neighbors more and more, because they naturally are forced into coalition against you. And once they're forced into coalition against you, your influence goes down and doesn't go up, because you're surrounded by enemies that block you everywhere. And that's what's been happening.
I see your point, but the coalition is not a very cohesive one. I mean, if you're talking about the territorial disputes over oil and gas in the South China Sea, it's not as if everybody is ganging up on China. You've got Vietnam and the Philippines, for example, which are rivals. You've got other regional rivals there, and the fact that regional countries are themselves divided over these natural resources, that's just helping China, isn't it?
There are some internal gears going like this, but the principal coalition you see already emerging is Japan, India, and Vietnam. Japan is helping Vietnam economically, the Indians militarily, and please, Japan, India, and Vietnam, between them, have more people than China. They have more economic, gross domestic product, more economic capacity than China, and at least as much technology as China. So already just 3 countries have been getting together. There are more and more intensive material cooperation going on, even without any other players involved, such as the United States.
Sure.
So this is an inevitability. Germany reached that in 1914. Best universities, best industry, the world's biggest bank as it then was, and at the same time trying to add military power to it, result being encircled. Once you're encircled, you lose your power.
But at the moment, closer to home, China seems to, well, as I said, at the moment, they're playing off rivals against one another. And even in, closer to China, Japan and Korea have got different strategic interests. I mean, it doesn't seem that Korea and Japan are completely united against China at the moment.
Not at all. They're not at all united, and this is all very new, because until a few years ago, China was following a specific line of conduct, peaceful rise. Peaceful rise, meaning threatening nobody. Therefore, all of this phenomenon is very new, and as you point out, there are all kinds of unresolved issues within it. But even without resolving all the intra issues, just the fact that the United States has shifted, has abandoned its attempts in the whole Middle Eastern area, and has switched to the Pacific, and it provides a sort of backbone for the regional powers, just the 3 regional powers that have no disagreements. Japan, Vietnam, and India, already these 3 are quite enough to do a lot of blocking on their own.
Okay, so it's fairly new, but perhaps these countries will in time truly gang up on China. We'll have to leave it there.
In fact, they're resolving it day by day as we speak.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much for your insights, Edward Luttwak from Washington. That's all we have time for on the interview on France 24.